Hello everybody, and welcome to this Sustainability Practice Group, the first one of 2014. With that, I want to hand over to Mark to introduce today's session. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Matt, and welcome to those of you who've tuned in. I'm looking forward to Bill Freeman's presentation on product transparency declarations. It's particularly interesting to me because it's coming from the Resilient Floor Covering Institute. So you have manufacturers and stakeholders who've developed these declarations, as opposed to other fine declaration programs, HPDs, what LEED is doing, what Green Globes is doing. So some of us approach this from the professional side and developing it, other from the manufacturing and industrial side, and it's incredibly important we all listen to each other very carefully. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bill Freeman.
Mark, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the CSI webinar today. I'd like to kind of preface the presentation by just mentioning a couple of things. Those of you who are on the call who may have attended Green Build will probably remember back in 2012 at the Green Build meeting that there clearly was a theme, and that to us was the one of transparency. And many of the manufacturers, including the resilient flooring manufacturers that I represent, people like Armstrong and Congolium, Mannington, Tarkett, they really recognized the growing request for more information on the ingredients in the building materials. At the same time, again, those of you who attended Green Build remember that the health product declarations were introduced. In the 9 months following that 2012 Green Build meeting, there appeared to be somewhat of a reluctance on the part of building materials manufacturers to publish HPDs for several reasons, which I'm going to go into during my presentation. But immediately after that 2012 Green Build meeting, RFCI, the Resilient Floor Covering Institute, began working on a document that we thought would provide specifiers with the information that they were requesting. So the presentation you're going to hear today will provide you information on that document, which is the Product Transparency Declaration. But I think as you listen to the presentation, remember it's coming from the perspective of building product manufacturers. And these are the folks who ultimately will be requested or required to produce or publish any kind of a transparency document. So please just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So next, we're going to have Matt hit the slides for me. What I'd like to talk about is the agenda first, and what I'm going to cover is first the rationale for developing the Product Transparency Declaration, talk about the form and the declaration itself, and then we've had quite a few questions, so I think it's important to cover what are the differences between an HPD and a PTD. And then hopefully after that we'll have time so that if you have questions in the audience that you'll have a chance to ask, and I'll have an opportunity to respond to those questions. Next. So the question obviously by many people is, why would you develop a product transparency declaration? And that's what we'll talk about first. Next. There are multiple reasons, and I've listed 10 reasons for developing the Product Transparency Declaration. The first being what I alluded to a few minutes ago. There are a number of architects, not all, but a number of architects who are demanding transparency and more information. And number two, some of these architects want to know about the ingredients in the building material that they're contemplating specifying. Three, the Health Product Declaration focuses on ingredients as pure chemicals. Fourth, there's a reluctance of building materials manufacturers to publish HPDs, at least early on in the program after they were introduced. Five, the HPDs focus on hazard lists, which aren't considered, without consideration rather, for the exposure and risk factor. Next. Reason number 6, many of the 32 hazard lists which are contained in the HP are not what we would consider to be authoritative bodies. 7, the HPD requires disclosure of product formulas by manufacturers. 8, the HPDs encourage the use of third-party certification. 9, the HPD is not an assessment of risks associated with the use of the product. And finally, to our way of thinking, the HPD is quite complicated and a little bit complex to complete the form itself. Next. The product transparency, the health product declaration that I mentioned earlier was introduced at Greenbuild in November 2012. And the standard itself describes a declaration of product content and direct health hazards associated with exposure to the individual contents. And that word individual contents being a key issue when we talk about the PTD also. Next. The open standard itself, which many of you probably have seen, is a 40-page document and describes how manufacturers of building materials really are to disclose all types of information, which includes like measuring residuals, green screen benchmarks, and most of these details and so forth we kind of question that architects are really interested in, or maybe it's just more for those who are curiosity seekers. Next. When you look at the front page of the HPD to a product manufacturer, it's a little bit alarming. The emphasis is not at first glimpse on transparency, but rather on cancer, PTDs, reproductive hazards, all those things are right foremost when you open the first page of the HPD. Next. Just for starting information, the PTD, which we're going to talk about, does provide, again, for product transparency. It does list all the product ingredients. It is based on exposure and risk versus hazard, although all these ingredients are listed, if necessary, as hazards. And finally, it provides for labeling or labeling requirements because of this hazard listing that we have. Next. This is the cover sheet on the PTD, and specifically you can see it covers 7 areas. First, the product ingredients, ingredients identified as hazards, the warning label requirements for a finished product based on those hazard listings. It has in there a listing for intentionally added heavy metals, talks about VOC emissions and VOC content information, recycled content, which some architects are interested in, and finally about any environmental certifications which the product on the PTD are involved with. Next. Section A provides the first listing of the product ingredients, and next to it the CAS number for each one of those product ingredients. These ingredients are listed for the product in descending order based on quantity, by weight, not volume. So somebody looking at this could see what the most prevalent ingredient is in the product itself. Then next to each one of those ingredients, you have to actually check whether that ingredient is listed on one of the 6 different regulatory lists. And you can see what they are, and we'll talk more about these later. The second thing in this section A is the listing of heavy metals, and you can see where you check if the product again contains these heavy metals which are added as functional ingredients. Next. If you go to section B, you're talking about whether this product must be labeled according to, again, the OSHA HAZCOM regs or California Prop 65. And this, again, whole declaration also, it includes both the workers who are going to be installing these materials in a building as well as the building occupants. So the first one is the HAZCOM, and if there is an ingredient which must be labeled because of the ingredient or product, you just put down the signal word, the hazard, and again where the complete statement can be located, whether it's on a safety data sheet or a label where it's located. And then secondly, if the ingredient requires, because of it, requires a warning label on Prop 65, you put down the ingredient which triggered the hazard label, and then you put the warning language which was required for that building material. Next. Section C covers volatile organic compounds emissions. And what we're doing here is asking building materials manufacturers to say whether they comply with the requirements under California Section 1350, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We also ask you to put down the TVOC, total volatile organic compounds, in the 3 ranges. And this kind of mirrors what is in lead 4, where they'll ask you for the ranges for your TVOCs. Next, this is the CARB requirements for composite wood products, and it has to do with formaldehyde emissions. You're checking boxes saying whether you comply, whether you're exempt. And as you continue down this section, we talk about South Coast Air Quality Management District Rule 1168. And again, most of you know it. This is the requirement still in effect in many places for liquid materials like adhesives and sealants. And it's based on VOC content versus emissions. Following next is the another South Coast Air Quality Management District rule, which is for architectural coatings, whether you comply with it. And then the second one for CARB, which also applies to architectural coatings. So this form is not only for hard materials, but for liquids like paints, coatings, and adhesives. Next. Section, you've gone one too many, Matt, I'm sorry. We're on Section D. Section D on recycled content. Again, architects in many cases are interested in whether manufacturers are using recycled content or not. And in this case, the manufacturer lists whether it's post-consumer or pre-consumer, and the definitions here of recycled content is based on the ISO definitions. Section D is this area I mentioned previously, and that is, are there any certifications for like VOC emissions or recycled content, or maybe it's an EPD, environmental product declaration. You can list those here, which may be of interest also to the specifier considering this product. Next. For the PTD, we ask the name and signature of a responsible person as title from a manufacturer who is issuing the PTD and the actual issue date. And then we require somebody to give a phone, some kind of contact information, email or phone. So if somebody had a question on these, making sure it's up to date or whatever, they could call the company and find out about this information. Next. In the information, and we'll give you the address, you can look and have all this information yourself at the RCI website, but there's a complete guide for how you complete the product transparency declaration. So it goes into detail about the information which is required, hopefully to make it easier for the manufacturer to complete the form. Next. There's also information which you can have access to, which talks about the information which is important to specifiers of building materials, the purpose of the PTD, the information provided, ingredient disclosure, all kinds of things which will help explain in detail the reason for the PTD. Next. Now the questions that we've been asked, and I'm sure you have in your mind too, is why did RCI start developing this form? Isn't the HPD adequate? So it's natural to get questions from people about, what is the difference between a PTD and an HPD? And I'd like to take you through that now to make sure you do understand the differences. First, a major difference between the two is the PTD focuses on a finished building material delivered to the job site. So it's whatever the specifier is specifying he wants in that building, and that product is delivered to the job site. That is what the PTD is focusing on. Versus the HPD, which focuses on the pure raw materials, not the finished product, which are in the building product itself. Next. The PTD focuses on ingredients, the hazard list, and exposure and risk for a finished building material. Whereas the HPD focuses on the first two, the ingredients, and the hazard list does not get into exposure and risk. Next. This is a quote from the scope of the HPD. It describes a declaration of product content and direct health hazards which are associated with the exposure to its individual contents. Next. The HPD does not require information to be provided about exposure and risk, as I just mentioned. The exposure to the individual contents typically involves workers manufacturing the raw materials or manufacturing the finished building material. That is where the exposure is going to occur. And then third, the PTD does address the exposure to the individual contents, but in the finished building material. Next. An example that I've used, and there's many more like this to show the difference, is an ingredient which most of you are familiar with, very common, titanium dioxide, TiO2. It's used extensively in white cool roofs. It's used in linoleum. It's used in toothpaste. It's used in all kinds of paints for the lighter colors. And it's listed as a carcinogen on IARC and California Prop 65. It's listed on the HPD as a cancer hazard. It is also listed on the PTD as a cancer hazard under IARC and Prop 65. So there's no difference there. The only thing is it does not take us to the next step, and that is there exposure? And I think most of you agree that the exposure to TiO2 in roofs and linoleum and toothpaste is not significant. On the other hand, if you inhaled TiO2 in a powdered form, there would be a risk with anybody who is exposed to TiO2. So this is the major difference between, again, a risk exposure factor and just saying there's a hazard involved with an ingredient. Next. In the HPD exclusions, it says specifically the declaration is not an assessment of risk associated with the actual use of the product. And the PTD most certainly addresses risk from using the finished building product. So whatever it is, VOC emissions or any kind of ingredients which are migrating through building material and so forth, those would be covered in a PTD based on the risk exposure factor which is covered. Next. The HPD specifically says that it does not address the potential health impacts of substances used or created during manufacturing that do not appear in the final product as residuals, nor substances created during the combustion or other degradation process. This appears to be in conflict with what you're going to see on the next slide. Next. The HPD does make extensive use of green screen for designating benchmark 1 chemicals, which addresses the health impacts of substances used during the manufacturing, although the same substances may never appear in the final product. So to us, this is a conflict between what is in the HPD open standard and yet what is being requested to be reported on the HPD form using the extensive use of green screen. Next. To us, or manufacturers, the PTDs use much less complicated reporting versus the HPDs that are so complex that manufacturers are hiring third-party, again, firms to complete the HPD document itself. Next. This comment, which was made recently in Environmental Building News by Aaron Smith, and Aaron is chair of the HPD Collaborative Manufacturers Advisory Panel. And basically what Aaron has said is that none of the material ingredient reporting is easy. Most companies don't have a design for the environment person on staff or a toxicologist on staff. The solution is to bring in a consultant. So this, we completely disagree with as far as the PTD, which we've made it easy enough that you don't have to have people, third parties, come in to complete a PTD. Next. Those, again, who are at Greenbuild might have heard some of these things, but these are some of the, again, offers by some well-known organizations, which you're all familiar with, offering to help manufacturers complete an HPD. And I'm not going to name these organizations. I'll just call them X, Y, and Z. But the first offer, which was made around the time of Greenbuild by Organization X, was a Greenbuild special. that if a manufacturer paid $1,000 per HPD, they get a free listing for 2013 and a $500 listing for 2014, which you assume means it's a $500 listing each year that you have an HPD on their website. Next. Organization Y was offering to fill out the HPD for $5,000 for the first HPD, provide a 20% discount on each additional HPD of similar products. But if there was a pilot program requirement from the HPD Collaborative requiring an on-site visit, it would be an additional $3,000, and it wouldn't include the travel expense. The annual review is required for this, and an annual cost that's 50% of the initial verification cost. But if there was a change in chemistry, it required a new verification. However, if you had similar products in the system, 25 or more HPDs, the pricing would vary. Next, and just one other example of Organization Z, they were charging $6,500 per HPD, and we assumed that there would be some type of a certification included with this offer. Next. Question has come up, and maybe your firms have discussed it also, and that is, who has the liability for the information that's being reported in the HPD? And is it the building product manufacturer, or is this one of the certification bodies which is helping to fill out the forms themselves? I think this is still a question that's being debated. Next, continuing with the differences between the HPD and the PTD, PTDs do not require the disclosure of product formulas by reporting the exact percentage of each product ingredient, versus the HPDs require the percentage of each ingredient to be disclosed, which includes the indication of whether that percentage is changing over time. I think you can maybe understand why product manufacturers are reluctant to give the exact percentage of each ingredient for obvious reasons, that they're trying to compete in the marketplace with a product they think is better than their competitors. Providing this information obviously is just giving out the secrets to their formulas. We talked about originally, previously in this presentation, where you have to list all the ingredients, again listed in the most common and most abundant ingredient, but you don't have to give the exact percentage in the PTD. Next. The PTDs require a responsible company official to verify the information. The HPDs require third-party certification by listing the options of self-certification, second and third-party certification. And many of you may be aware that recently the HPD Collaborative has joined with 7 product sustainability assessment companies and are developing now an official protocol for third-party verification. So we're assuming this is what everybody would have to provide in a certification to be, again, recognized by the Health Product Declaration or Collaborative. Next. From a manufacturer's, again, viewpoint, we don't understand the need for third-party certification. If today your material safety data sheet is being accepted without third-party certification, if information you're providing to the Pharos project does not have to have third-party certification, and if the information you provide to the government in the EPA TRI reporting, the question we raise is, why, again, do you have to have third-party certification for information you're providing for a health product declaration? And having said that, again, at the recent Greenville meeting, some of you may have seen that some of the largest building materials manufacturers, those that have deep pockets, did appear to be providing now HPDs, and they appeared to us to be more focused on providing a marketing advantage over their smaller competitors than was providing the HPD. But that's, what is happening now in the marketplace. Next. Some more differences. The PTD uses 6 authoritative hazard lists versus the HPD, which uses 30+ hazard lists, and I think it's actually 32 with a number of lists, which you need to screen your ingredients for on the HPD list. Next. The PTD uses 6 authoritative lists. You can see these here: IARC, National Toxicology Program, the OSHA carcinogen list, Prop 65, REACH, which is the European list of substances of very high concern, and finally the US EPA Toxic Release Inventory. To our way of thinking, these 6 lists are generally accepted as science-based, peer-reviewed, and have gone through some type of a consensus process before being published, so much so that most of them are part of some type of a regulatory program. Next. These 6 lists that we use cover cancer, reproductive toxicity, persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals, and also developmental toxicity. Next. There is concern on our part about, many of the so-called hazard issuing agencies, a term that sounds very authoritative, but in reality some of these lists really are not. I'll just give you one example. This is the first one on the list that you have to screen your ingredients for. It's the Association of Occupational Environmental Clinics. A lot of the work these folks do is based on, again, hazards to asthma exposure. And in 1991, they developed a national surveillance database to capture all these newly diagnosed cases of both occupational and environmental illnesses and chronic injuries that they saw at clinics around the country. Today, the database that they have contains over 1,000 materials or ingredients that they have now logged based on these cases. And what happens typically is a group of physicians decide, based on these case reports, which materials are classified as being hazardous. Well, the HPD uses this list. So any of the building product ingredients you're listing on the HPD, which are listed by AOEC as hazardous, now are required to be listed as hazards on the HPD. Next. I mentioned there's over 1,000 different hazards on this list. And you go through the list, you can see, things like carbon black, fiberglass, polyvinyl chloride, chlorine, vinegar, and then you get into coffee beans, sunflowers, the frog, the cricket, honeybee, and fruit flies. So if your product contains any of these 1,000 ingredients, it's considered a hazard and must be reported on the HPD list. Next. The PTD does not require the use of green screen, a program which to us is incomplete. It's still using draft assessments, and it's a non-consensus program that lacks, at this point, a track record. To us, green screen is no more than really an unofficial group of people who are analyzing raw chemicals and developing, quote, a red list based on their subjective judgment. So we're not sure that's ready for prime time, but it's obviously the HPD uses green screen extensively to identify benchmark 1 chemicals which have been so designated by green screen as potentially hazardous. Next. We feel it's important as a document, as important as a PTD, that it have input from all stakeholders, which is really not the case with the HPD, which was drafted by a small group of people, but draft did not involve product manufacturers after the actual HPD was introduced and published. The PTD is currently going through the ANSI Consensus Process to ensure that all stakeholders have an opportunity to participate in the final development of the PTD. Currently, it's going through the process in ASTM Committee E60 on sustainability. In fact, the first ballot is now out for balloting, and the ballot closes in about 3 weeks. So any of you on this call today or a member of E60, I encourage you to participate in this development process and get your comments in on this first ballot which is going through. To us, it's unclear at this point about the process which is used and who decides what is included in current and any future changes to HPDs. It's really not in writing how that actually takes place and who makes those decisions. Next. Again, many of you or some of you may have participated in the October 10th Environmental Building News webcast. And what happened here was Environmental Building News put together a webcast with the title Increased Transparency, Increased Liability for Designers. And that could have said for specifiers, architects, all kinds of people selecting building materials. The moderator for the program was Russ Perry, who's very instrumental in the development of the HPDs and is well respected with the Smith Group architectural firm, and Tristan Roberts, who's the editor for Environmental Building News for their lead user program. They brought together the chief legal counsels for some of the larger architectural firms. You can see the list: Smith Group, HKS, Smith, Skidmore, Owens Merrill, and also one I don't have here listed, but was on, I believe, was Brody Stevens, who's the chief counsel for Perkins and Will. And the question before this group of attorneys was, who has the legal responsibility, the liability for what is included in an HPD? Next. These are kind of my take on the results of the webcast, but I think they're shared by many other people who participated in the webinar. First, that building product manufacturers clearly have a responsibility for the ingredients in their products, including those ingredients which are designated as hazardous. The second finding or summary point would be that architects, and this is according to the legal counsel, architects requesting and receiving HPDs take on the additional responsibility for deciding if hazardous ingredients listed in HPD will present a health hazard for building occupants. And that's a real concern, obviously, not just for HPDs, it would be for PTDs also. And the last point is that some of these counsels did provide, again, a remedy by saying an architect can decide not to make a determination of potential health impacts from the ingredients in a product by simply advising the client, in most cases this would be the building owner, of the hazardous ingredients which are in the, again, products that the architect is specifying. So, obviously, not all architectural firms are requesting HPDs. There are some large firms that don't want anything to do with HPDs and probably won't want anything to do with PTDs either, because they don't want to take the chance of this additional potential liability. Next. For those of you who are interested in, again, any CEUs, the Architectural Record, the October issue, has a CEU available. You can go to their website and, again, go through even more information, the PTDs, and get credits at that point. Next. This brings us to the question point or portion of the webinar. Because we've gone through most of the information. We're going to provide you with information where you can get more info on the PTDs at the RCI website. But I'd like to just conclude by saying that as building product manufacturers, the folks that I represent, I think the need to provide specifiers with more information on the ingredients and the materials that you're considering specifying, I think is an important issue. And we're taking it seriously. And I think when you look at the transparency documents that are actually available in the marketplace today, we believe that the Product Transparency Declaration, which we've just gone through, can provide the information in kind of a precise and easy-to-read format, which can, again, respond to some of these requests that we're getting from specifiers. So I'm going to end my presentation there and see if there aren't some questions that the audience had that I can try and answer for you. So thank you again for participating in this webinar. So I'll turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, Bill. Mark here. Is there a cost to the building product manufacturer for participating in the PTD program?
There is not. I mean, it's just the time it takes their staff to fill out the PTD, but there's nowhere else where there should be a cost involved, no.
Does RFCI maintain a list of people who have PTDs?
We do not. That's a good question. although RFCI developed the PTD, we knew from the beginning that it really is not appropriate for, again, RFCI to, control this form. We thought it should be, go through the standards operation, like somebody like ASTM, control what the requirements are, which means all stakeholders can make changes in the form, not just RFCI. So I think what you'll see happening is you'll see individual companies that wish to produce PTDs. They'll have them on their website. So if a specifier wants to find them, they'll go to that website. But we don't think it's appropriate for, again, the RFCI to be having a website which contains a list of, paint manufacturers or adhesive manufacturers or whatever on a website. It's not our intent.
And with your knowledge of the PTD requirement, when you were talking about VOCs, is that, do you know whether that's as it's placed or when it is in place? So with regard to a paint, is the PTD talking about the VOC as it's placed or when it's cured?
I think the paint folks, if they answer that question, would say when you specify our paint, okay, that number one, it will, again, comply with the South Coast Air Quality Management District Rule 1168, which means the amount of VOCs we're putting in a gallon or liter of paint. And then secondly, the paint manufacturers that are now complying with 1350, it's going to be a VOC emissions test. But as you know, that's done in an emissions chamber. It's not done on the job site. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm concerned as an architect and spec writer that, it's fine if USGBC monetizes LEED or green globes. It's certainly okay for people to make a living, and it costs money to promulgate programs. And because LEED stayed away from individual product certification, it's natural for a number of groups to move into the situation. And certainly the building product manufacturers tell me, that there are dozens of third-party certification programs that cost a lot of money and are problematic. So, the goal really of the specifier or the designer is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, health being one of those words. So it's, I think, a natural focus that people want to know. Unfortunately, at least in my 30-year career, I don't think I've ever seen a class or a course that teaches an architect how to evaluate the health impacts of materials. So if the schools aren't teaching it, and if the continuing ed isn't teaching it, then I'm a little bit concerned. Also, as you alluded, there's some people that like PVC, some that don't. If it's on a roof and it's a really good roof, certainly product performance. Health is one characteristic of that, but I'd rather have a roof membrane that kept the water out rather than one that had recycled content. They're just priorities, and for people who put the health priority first, and I agree, there's nothing more than health. You just have to decide that you're smart enough to do it, and I actually believe architects are smart enough to do it because, given the choice of perhaps lead or no lead, it's perhaps an easy choice. But between one 6-syllable chemical and another 6-syllable chemical, and that goes beyond my personal expertise. And so I'm just, I guess I applaud RFCI for putting a document out there, that at least will standardize how a product manufacturer can respond, but we're nowhere near at the end of the discussion on this. I think the EPA says 17,000 new chemicals come into the marketplace each year, and even they can't keep track of them. So it's a problem, and we need to certainly continue this dialogue. Matt, did you have any questions that came in?
Hey, Mark, Bill Freeman, I appreciate your comments very much. Can I just make one comment? That is, when you refer to PVC, and a lot of our companies that I represent make vinyl flooring, obviously, but if you think about it, PVC, okay, polyvinyl chloride is not on any of those 6 lists. It's not on IARC, it's on no lists, okay, as being a hazard. And that's what we're talking about, is delivered to a job site. What people sometimes get hung up on is how you make some of the chemicals originally in the product. Those chemicals are not in the finished building products, and that's what we're trying to make the difference. You don't see people going after, wood flooring because wood dust is a carcinogen. It's on Prop 65. You don't see them going after steel with the smelting and so forth. You don't see them going after crystalline silica for ceramic tile, which is a carcinogen. And you have to look at, from a specifier's standpoint, what is the product? Is there a hazard with the product? And not just what is happening way back when some of the chemicals are produced.
Well, somewhere along the line, somebody said without plastics, the planet would only support 1.5 billion people, not 7 billion people. And there's a new book out called Baby Burden, I think written by a doctor, that talks about how babies born today have 80 chemicals in them that don't exist in nature, that, of course, they got through their mother. So it's a very complex topic. We're trying to go faster. We're trying to do it right. So we really need to continue this dialogue. Matt, again?
Yeah, there's one question here from Jennifer. She's just wondering, are PTDs recognized as meeting the materials declaration requirement for LEED version 4?
They are currently not. Okay, we have discussed it with U.S. Green Building Council, and so that the folks on the phone know what's happening. They've had several requests for what you call a U.S. Green Building Council approved program under that product transparency credit. And what they are doing, and hope to have this put together here in the next probably 6 weeks, is what the criteria is going to be to approve, again, some of these ingredient reporting systems, including the PTDs. So we're waiting and excited to talk to them about the PTDs, and then they'll make the final decision on whether they will include the PTD along with the HPD in LEED version 4 credits.
All right. Well, that's the only question I have from the audience currently.
Is there, Bill, is the PTD form being upgraded, or it's stable?
It is now on the RFCI website. You can go up and actually download it, and you can actually fill the form in online. So if you have more ingredients, it keeps giving you more spaces. So it's an active form that anybody can use. And if you want to print it off the RFCI website, you can do that also. But as soon as we get done with this balloting process at ASTM, I'm sure there'll be some changes to the form, but it doesn't mean people can't get started and look at using it now.
So do you happen to know the title of the ASTM document? Is it a standard method for product transparency declaration or something like that?
Currently, the title, okay, of the work item is the standard practice for issuing product transparency declarations.
Okay. And that's going through, you said that's already going through some balloting.
Yes.
And usually it takes 2 or 3 rounds to to reach a consensus. So you think it's still a year away, or hard to tell?
It probably is. It depends on how much conversation that we get. I mean, we're hoping we get lots of people that want to participate. As I said, we've had 6 comments. Right now it's 93% affirmative on the vote, but as those of you on the phone know, you have to answer all these negatives. So we'll be working on them, and then in April there's a meeting in Toronto where we'll have a face-to-face meeting. We're hoping, that we can move this right along, and a year from now that we'd have a published standard.
Well, I think many people know the advantage to a published standard is that electronically you can sort of crawl the web, look for a PTD, look for the response to item 4, and it'll be in the same place, and you'll get the same information. So there's certainly a great value in standardizing the location of information. Then people have to draw their own conclusions about what's listed. Matt, are you showing anything else?
At this point, I see no other hands raised. No other questions have been submitted.
Okay, Bill, did you have any final comments, or are you all set?
I am all set. Again, I appreciate those folks on the call taking the time to listen to this, and hopefully, if you have any questions, we'd be glad to try and answer them, or if you want to give us input through ASTM E60, we'd love to have you participate.
All right, well then, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate your presentation. Next month, our Sustainability Practice Group topic is on LEAD version 4. It's presented by Richard Moore, a co-chair of this committee, and looking at what it's really going to take to how the credits have changed and how you're going to earn them. So once again, thank you to Bill Freeman and our FCI for making this happen. Have a good day.